So now we'll move on to some of those future-looking questions and thinking about where are we headed. So over time, we've evolved as a system, and we've evolved as a society as well. So the federal government really, I think I mentioned, funds regional center services through something called the waiver. And the waiver is known as a home and community-based services waiver. And really, it's to provide services in a community. And over time, the federal government's definition of of community, as well as our understanding of community, has evolved. So once upon a time, when we were moving people, first moving people out of developmental centers, community just meant that you were receiving services outside of the walls of a state institution. And then we sat with that definition for a bit. And then next, about 20 years ago, we started to think about how to make community mean more, and how to make sure that when we said someone lived in the community, that it didn't feel like just a smaller version of an institutional setting. And so we started to talk about what makes a residential setting home-like. What makes it feel like home? Is it the ability to decorate your room? Is it the ability to access snacks? What are those features? And now the federal government in 2014 pushed a little further. And they said that community means that services must be integrated in and support full access to the greater community. So when we say community now, what we're beginning to think about is that individuals with developmental disabilities should have the same access to their communities that you or I have. And that's an important evolution. And while change may feel slow, it's impressive to see in the last 50 years how far we've come in that. Additionally, the federal government is asking us to think about work. So work, as we know, is more than just a paycheck. Work means something to all of us. So oftentimes when I meet someone for the first time, the first question out of their mouth is, what do you do? Work gives us identity, it gives us social circles, it gives us the ability to purchase things, which gives us more freedom and more choice. And so in the last few years, there have been expectations at both the state and federal level related to trying to help people with developmental disabilities to more successfully integrate into the workforce. And for instance, in 2011, the federal government said that the time that people spend training for work should be time limited. In 2014, the federal government came out with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, which said that integration in a work setting isn't just being in a setting where there's people without disabilities as well, but it really means working alongside peers in the same job and having the same opportunities for advancement. So again, we continue to evolve and we continue to expect more from our service delivery and our system. We, as I mentioned, since the mid-90s have been working very hard to help people transition from developmental centers into other settings. And we currently are in the process of 3 developmental center closures at this time. So for Sonoma Developmental Center up in Sonoma County, for Fairview Developmental Center in Orange County, as well as for a portion of Porterville Developmental Center in Tulare County, about halfway between Fresno and Bakersfield. And these developmental center closures mean a few things. It means that we're moving people into more integrated settings in the community and more individualized settings to meet their needs. But it also means that we in the community are having to develop new models of care to support this population. So we've developed models of care to support people with complex medical and behavioral support needs. And it also means that we need to think about how we can support people to stay in the community. The developmental centers, while they oftentimes had residents who had been there for a very long time, they also served as sort of the placement of last resort if people were really struggling to maintain community placement. And so as a result of the pending closure of these centers, we're doing a lot of development and thinking about how best to support people who would otherwise struggle to maintain community placement and to best support them in the community. Additionally, in 2013, Governor Brown signed a bill that created the building blocks for what's known as the Self-Determination Program. And the Self-Determination Program really is designed to give individuals and their families more choice, responsibility, and control, and much more flexibility in terms of service delivery, by allowing families and individuals to select and purchase services through service providers who may not be part of the traditional regional center service delivery system. So for instance, if there's someone in an individual's community who would be a good fit, but for helping the person to seek a job or to recreate in the community, then those things could be achieved through someone who isn't part of the standard regional center service delivery system. People will still have the choice to use established service providers known as vendors, but they won't have to for the most part. And again, we see here the theme that person-centered thinking and planning is central to this process. So we really, in order to determine how best to support individuals in an individualized way, need to really understand what are their goals, what are their drives, what are their desires, and how can we come together to find things that will meet their needs in a way that best suits them. So this program is pending federal approval. So I mentioned earlier that the state of California is heavily dependent on federal dollars for its developmental services system. This program will be just the same in terms of funding structure. And so when a state wants to do something different, they have to ask the federal government for permission to do that new thing. And the application for this program is with the federal government, and the state and federal government continue to work out the details of it. But once approved, then this program will launch. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think during the question and answer portion, one of the challenges in California is related to our rate structure system. The state is in the process of looking at vendor rates and how better to structure those, but there's some things that make doing business in California difficult. So California has among the nation's, I think the nation's highest workers' comp rates. And in our field, workers' comp rates tend to be high because people are receiving direct support. Additionally, real estate costs are very high in California, and we have a lot of old funding models that need updating. And so this makes finding enough vendors at times challenging. And so we're encouraged by the process that the state is undergoing with the contractor who is looking at how to structure a rate model that makes some sense. And that report is due to the state no later than March of 2019. During the question and answer period, someone asked about federal uncertainty and what those things might mean for our system. So we know that our system is heavily reliant on federal dollars, but we also know that we as a state are heavily reliant on federal dollars. And so there's been lots of talk and lots of discussion about what if the federal government changes the way that it participates in Medicaid, which is called Medi-Cal in California? What if some of these tax reform efforts are a direct hit on our system in terms of one of the proposals is related to whether an individual can deduct the cost of medical equipment? What if those things happen? I'm very pleased that up until now, the state has really taken a long view of all of this, and while certainly has done analysis related to the potential impacts, and some of the potential impacts are huge, I'm not going to lie. The governor and our legislature made a decision to build this year's budget based on what we know today, because there are so many iterations and so many different proposals that seem to appear overnight and then disappear, that responding to each and every one is really complicated. But we know that Medicaid funding is huge for the state of California. So not only does our system rely on it, but so does in-home supportive services, as well as some special education services, as well as CCS, as well as Medi-Cal, of course. So there's a lot of things in flux, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And, you know, I think we're all beginning to think about what that would look like, but nobody has really clear answers. And luckily, we are in a mode of not making decisions based on what we don't know today. As I mentioned earlier, the diversity of California has increased significantly since the development of the regional center system. And so we're really working as a regional center system to figure out how best to support diverse communities. As I think I mentioned earlier, of course, that means language access, but it also has to do with cultural norms. What services are families and individuals from diverse communities seeking, and what would fit into their expectations and their desires and their goals and their objectives? One of the things that we know is that individuals who are non-white tend to live at home with their families longer into adulthood. And during the last recession, there were some service limitations put into place that really impacted family support services. And those included the establishment of a cap on respite services, as well as the elimination of camp and social recreation services. So one of the legislative priorities that we had this year was the lifting of the respite cap. And so as of January 1st, 2018, the cap on respite will be lifted. Again, we go back to what is the appropriate level of respite or any other service, and it's needs driven and dependent on the goals and objectives of that individual. So our top legislative priority for this year is addressing the restriction on the purchase of camp and social recreation services, because we want to ensure that we're supporting families and that for individuals living at home with their families, particularly those who do so into adulthood, that we're really meeting those needs. And we know that as we work through to support diverse communities, that it includes one of the huge elements in order to be successful in that arena is to rely on strong community partnerships. So, you know, just like any other service system, we can't do it alone, and regional centers recognize the need to cooperate and collaborate with community partners who really have an emphasis and specialty in terms of service to certain diverse communities. So with that, I'll be happy to take additional questions.